Hello, Namaskar. Welcome to my pod, the CAA Show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis. My name is Juggi Bhasin. To become a subscriber, all you have to do is to press that red button on your screen. Subscription is, of course, completely free. Would also really appreciate if you could like this video and share this video with your friends. All right, so the Prime Minister is going to Canada. And of course, it has come as a shock, as a surprise to many people, both in India and outside, especially in many parts of Canada, where there is protest growing that why has the Prime Minister of India been invited to the G7 summit? All these things are happening. And the question we really need to be asking is that what are the real reasons why the Prime Minister of India has been invited to the G7 summit? Of course, ostensibly, we can say that the main reason why he is being invited is, as it has also been explained by the Prime Minister of Canada, that India is the fourth largest economy in the world. Supply chains also, India is a very important part of the supply chains in the world. These are the ostensible reasons which are given. And those, of course, are very valid reasons. They are legitimate reasons, but there's something more behind the reason why the Prime Minister of India is going to Canada. And today in this podcast, I'm going to explore that real reason that why our Prime Minister has been invited to Canada. Because please remember, keep the background in mind. The invite has come maybe only 2 weeks before the summit, which is very late. Normally, these kind of invites are given much in advance, but it has come as a last minute invite, even though the Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, personally invited the Prime Minister on telephone, and our Prime Minister graciously accepted. But if you were not aware of this, then be aware of this, that this invite is not only the invite of the Prime Minister of Canada, it is a collective invite of the G7 countries to India and to our Prime Minister. No question about that. And again, see the background to that. The tension between India and Canada were at an all-time, are still very high. Those issues of Nijjar's death, so-called the Indian hand in Nijjar's death, all those issues have not really been settled. The matter is sub judice. But the matters have not been settled. There's a lot of acrimony on that particular issue. And then, of course, there is the Khalistan issue. We know how the Khalistanis are out to create trouble in this, in this particular entire issue. But despite all that, despite this opposition in Canada, despite the shock and surprise even in India, the Prime Minister is still going. And therefore, it begs the question, what are the real reasons why the Prime Minister is going to Canada? What egged on Prime Minister Carney to invite our Prime Minister to Canada? Why did the collective G7 want our Prime Minister to, why it wants the Prime Minister to come to Canada? And I'll tell you those reasons. Before I explain those reasons, understand this, that in a matter of a few weeks, I would say, not even days, in a matter of few weeks, amazing geopolitical changes have occurred, not once, but twice, in a very big way. The first big geopolitical change, I think, occurred during the time when Operation Sindur was being carried out. It is still, of course, in force, but in military terms, it is not being carried out. We know that. But during the time Operation Sindur was being carried out by India, in military terms, amazing geopolitical changes were happening. And now, post Operation Sindur, that is in the military sense, amazing new changes are also happening, which have turned the picture completely, almost, I would say, 180 degrees. And what are those changes? I'm going to talk about that. During Operation Sindur, what had happened was this. When we carried out Operation Sindur, by and large, the world was stunned and shocked at India's military prowess. No question about it. But various nations, both in the East and the West, I'm arguing, I'm not only saying it's the West, both in the East and the West, collectively, I would say, all across the world, many powerful countries felt threatened by India. And therefore, if not directly, but maybe indirectly, but a lot of them were involved in, I'm going to use these words, aiding and abetting this disinformation campaign that India had botched up Operation Sindur. And therefore, that entire story, if you remember, the story of the six Rafales being shot down by the Pakistani Air Force, that story gained traction in the Western media. There were a lot of buyers for that story initially, not only in media circles, but probably in the governments also. So this narrative was going on. Nobody was ready to believe India's side of the story during Operation Sindur. And to my mind, it was done deliberately because what had really happened was the inner real details of Operation Sindur were all absolutely known by especially the Western powers, but I think even by Russia also. Because look, we live today in the communication era, we live in the satellite age. Everything is mapped out, everything can be seen, can be heard, can be pried upon, everything is known. It's very difficult to keep things, you can't hide things from people at all. The truth is actually known, even though AI assists in a lot of fakery and all that, we know that, but still, despite all those things, the truth cannot be hidden. So a lot of powerful countries in the world knew what we had achieved and they were spooked by it. They were very much spooked because obviously it meant that India had arrived as a military power of note. It meant that it had these tremendous defense and offensive systems, which could again be exported to many countries, which again threatened the defense potential, exporting potential of many countries. And therefore, I think a lot of countries were egging on, if not encouraging directly, in the misinformation campaign in the initial phases that India had botched up Operation Sindur. And along with that campaign, they were doing something else. They were propping up Pakistan. Because out of nowhere, Pakistan, remember, was in the doghouse before that. Pakistan had actually been, it's like a beggar with a bowl, which is going all across the world. We know, begging arms and money for sustenance from the IMF, from the World Bank, from Saudi Arabia, from the US, from China, whatever. It's been, everybody knows that. And, but suddenly, as soon as Operation Sindoor kind of, in military terms ended, and then suddenly you find that the credentials of Pakistan were burnished within a day. They were like people suddenly equating India with Pakistan, which was ridiculous, if you ask me, because the size and the scope and the potential and the enormous wealth and the growth capacity of India, there's no comparison between Pakistan and India in that sense. But both countries were being equated, things were being spoken, oh, the great leadership of both the countries, etc. India was being put on par with Pakistan. That was a game which was going on. And of course, we felt slighted, we didn't like it, we felt hurt, we felt angry. Our teams went out, fanned out all over the world. We know that narrative. But the fact is, geopolitics, a lot of countries had decided silently to put down, downsize India. And if you remember carefully, at that time, there was no invite to the prime minister of our country from the G7 to attend the summit in Canada. Nothing of that sort, because I'm pretty sure the invites had been sent by then to all the other G7 members, but there was no invite for India at that point in time. And of course, there was a lot of opposition in India where people said, oh, the prime minister has not been invited. The opposition parties in India got into the act. We know about that story. But the fact is, everything looked very grey for India. It looked everything very dismal. This narrative was going on. And suddenly, within a matter of days, now I'm saying, the narrative changed again dramatically and completely. The Prime Minister of Canada calls up and he invites on telephone, personally invites the Prime Minister of India, and he would say that, and it was I believe to be a nice invitation and all that, and the Prime Minister graciously accepted. And then that begs the question: what changed? Because it's almost 2 weeks before the summit that the invite came. What really has changed? And I'll tell you what has changed. And major dramatic changes have occurred, which have, changed the mind of all these countries, especially the G7 countries, in inviting. Because it's now becoming clear it's not only an invite to the prime minister, it's like the G7 summit cannot happen without India. It cannot happen without our prime minister. Now, of course, our prime minister that way, of course, symbolizes the complete strength of India. And therefore, the Prime Minister had to be invited, I'm arguing. And the reasons for that are as follows. Three or four things, very important things happened. Number one, the lies of Pakistan, the fakery of Pakistan, the dissembling nature of the Pakistani narrative, the spurious nature of the Pakistani, story that we had won the war, we had downed the Rafales, India was on its knees, we had destroyed S-400, we had done this, we had done that, and all that. All that narrative was blown to bits when India produced the images, satellite imagery. It gave the facts of the case, but especially the important thing which happened at that time also was that the Noor Khan base was attacked by India. And now, again, I don't want to speculate. I have no idea. There is a theory that there were American interests on that base, and therefore this galvanized a lot of things into motion. Um, but that was among the one of the other important factors that those hitting of those air bases. See, nobody would be bothered with the terrorist bases. Terrorists are expendable commodities, and if they are killed, hundreds are killed or whatever, nobody bothers. But if you destroy military assets, if you destroy or if you cause damage to military assets, especially air bases, that's a big, big thing. That's not a small thing. And the world knew, all the important powers, the G7, everybody knew that Indian air bases had been untouched, whereas the Pakistani air bases stretching right up to their north, all the air bases, 9 to 11 air bases, had been bombed. And if we wanted, we could have completely destroyed them, but we did sufficient damage. Everybody knew that. And whether some foreign interests or assets also were destroyed in the case, that's of course a different story. I don't know much about that, but there is speculation about that also. Now, that happened. The lies could not be hidden. The truth began to slowly, I would say, the narrative began to emerge in the open, and that's of course made a lot of people uncomfortable. So that's the first thing which happened. Keep that in mind. Number two, around that time, uh, the story of India, another thing happened was that we stepped into being, or we actually graduated, which was on the cards in any case, into being the fourth largest economy. Our projections, our economic projections around that time, the quarterly projections and GDP figures were very, very robust. Good monsoon is also being predicted. A lot of positive things. The economic story of India was intact. Nothing had been affected. And more importantly, we had contained this short, intense 4-day war with Pakistan. We had contained it and not allowed it to spread to so that it could cripple the economy. We did not allow that. That was again something which was noticed by all leading powers in the world, that India had struck very hard, but at the same time, they also had the wisdom, they also had the might, they also had the sagacity to contain the conflict. That did not go unnoticed. But around this time, two very dramatic events took place, both in Europe and in the US. And I'll talk a little bit about that, which ultimately culminated in this invite of the Canadian Prime Minister to our Prime Minister. What happened in Europe? In Europe, as things stand now, especially after the Ukrainian strike on Russia, the coming to power of the German Chancellor and the pronouncements of the German Chancellor, things between Western Europe and Russia are really, really bad. In fact, Western Europe is to that extent preparing for war. They have already announced their intent of increasing their defense budget to 5%, which is huge, so that they have enough arms, ammunition, men, materials, um, technology, etc., to face up to the Russians if a conflict breaks out. Now, ask yourself this question: going by what's happening in Europe today, with all their contradictions, all their social imbalances, and all the other problems which they are facing, their intent of raising the defense budget to 5% is Well, it's important. It's a very important step. But how do you do it? How do you realize it? Can you only depend on the US? Maybe you can't because the US now is charting its own course. That's the first part of it. In any case, the US has to refurbish its own defense industry to match up to China. That for them is number one priority. So if the budget is raised to 5%, Europe's budget, which means many more ammunition cells, many more tanks, many more guns, a lot of armaments, do you think that all that is going to be manufactured in Europe only? Not possible. It's just not possible. And therefore, you would need to outsource a lot of that defense manufacturing to countries like India. And that is where India comes in. And Europe now cannot ignore that. The very fact that there is now, especially with the brilliant display of prowess of a defensive Akash Tir system, for instance, the indigenous systems which have played such a pivotal role in decimating Pakistani assets. Now, these countries are looking at India, A, to help them, for instance, in ammunition, shells, for instance, or in other products which they don't have a capacity to produce at the moment. Maybe there are certain high-end products which they will be producing, of course, in their own countries, but they would need a lot of other products, which probably India, that is where India comes in. That's the first part of it. But if you up your defense budget, then obviously your social service, your social securities, the entire infrastructure also goes for a toss. And therefore, you have to balance that. And therefore, the FTA, the free trade, the agreement between Europe and India becomes even more important because you need more and more trading. With a country like with a top economy now, with the world's fastest growing economy like India, to get the monies in because now you're facing problems vis-a-vis the US and therefore India becomes more important. And so therefore, in a certain sense, the escalation of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has triggered this entire geopolitical again, balance where the European countries realize that there is no option but to look at India. And I'll tell you why they are not looking at China, particularly for all these things. I'll explain that a little later. But India becomes extremely important in that scheme of things. And therefore, if from the G7, if countries like France or Italy, I would say even Britain included, they haven't pitched in and said, no, India has to be invited for the G7. I wouldn't be very surprised at all because of these reasons. They need India both in terms of replenishing, in terms of adding to the stocks of their military hardware, and also because of trade. They need India desperately. Number two, the real important things actually have been happening to that extent in the US also. There are two or three important things have happened. See, and this is partly speculation because we don't know, these are things which are done behind the scenes, but it has been a surprise and a bit of a worry for India that why has suddenly Pakistan become so important to the United States? Almost in a matter of days. It's come up from nowhere and suddenly, credit is being given to the Pakistani leadership, etc., and all those things. And now suddenly, I think there is a quietude which has descended on this particular narrative, and I'll explain what's going on. The first important thing which has happened is this Harvard thing. I'm not talking so much about the student unrest and the problems which are going on between Harvard and the new American, administration. That is well known. The real important thing is that the new dispensation in the United States has found out the China link, the China Harvard link, because evidently it's not only the Chinese students who are coming to study at Harvard, Indian students are also going there in large numbers. But the very fact that Chinese Communist Party officials, administrators who are being trained at Harvard, the story has come out, which is very, very worrying, not only for the US, but it would be worrying for any country, that literally, it's not an enemy country, but it's certainly not the most friendliest of countries for the United States. They have, of course, a great trade relationship or a very interesting trade relationship. But there is a battle for supremacy between number one and number two, between the US and China. We all know that. And yet, this link has emerged, which is very, very worrying for the. And I think any administration should be worried when universities, top universities in your own country, are training hostile foreign powers, their administrators, to be trained in your university. This is also going on in Harvard. So, the China link. That's number one. Number two, this entire Musk thing, think about it. Yes, personal equations between the president and Elon Musk and all that. I don't want to get into all that. That's all, top people, billionaires, this, that, and all that. That's fine. But don't forget, Musk has a very significant China link. His entire EV industry, his entire electric cars industry is based out of China. And are you telling me that Musk would not be under pressure from the Chinese to deliver to them, something or the other, or to make things difficult maybe for the US administration? There's a China link there also that again exploded out of nowhere. I mean, people are now saying, oh, we knew this relationship would break between the president and Elon Musk and all that. See, nobody knew this would happen. To be very honest, this came out of the blue. And now there is a theory which is emerging that who knows, maybe Musk could have been prodded by the Chinese to do this kind of a thing. Who knows? There is certainly a very important China factor, and Musk has all along said that he is not going to shift the supply chains of his electric car industry from China to any other country, and certainly not to India. That's been made very, very clear. So, the China angle. And the third thing, which has happened in the US, the riots in Los Angeles. My God, you see those riots. This is like a social cleaving of the nation almost in two parts. We talk of our own CAA riots and all that in Delhi and elsewhere in northern India, but they're nothing compared to what's happening out there. People, you got to see those horrific scenes, people with masks and, waving flags of Mexico, Guatemala, and all these other South American countries, and they are running wild on the streets. Frankly, what choice does the administration have but to send troops or whatever, even though people saying the army should not have been called? But that's not the story which I am talking about. The real story is why the riots have broken out at this point in time. Who instigated them? Why have they broken out at this point in time? You got to ask yourself that. And again, a lot of these incidents now may be pointing to the US or telling the US administration that, guys, that all games, in fact, to bring back a relationship with China and keep it on even keel, it's not going to work, because China will remain hostile to you, but in different ways. And then the fourth thing which has happened, there has been a briefing of the FBI by Kash Patel on this fentanyl issue, where the China link, some of it was being diverted from China, but through proxies, through places in India and all that. But there's been fantastic cooperation between the FBI and between the Indian drug enforcement authorities. And it has been praised by the FBI Director Kash Patel. And the fentanyl issue, which actually its point of origin might actually be China. So the China thing is cropping up in practically everything in the US. And therefore, the question which needs to be asked is this: if China is really your real problem, is your real enemy to that extent, if China is there, can Pakistan be far behind? That you need to remember. Because whether you like it or not, the Pakistan China linkage is very, very, very intrinsically deep. No question about it. And at the end of the day, I think the US will have to wonder that even if we were propping up Pakistan, if we were trying to give legitimacy to the Pakistani leadership, praising them or eulogizing their role in Operation Sindur, etc., whatever, I mean, what are we going to get from what we in Hindi call a bhuka nanga niche? What are we going to get out of it? That's the point which I think is probably the thinking which is going on right now. And therefore, I am arguing that this G7 invite to our Prime Minister, Yakani, the Canadian Prime Minister, has done it and all that. But G7, ladies and gentlemen, is still the top power, the big power in that G7 is the US. Nothing moves without the US's approval. And of course, the green signal probably has definitely come from the US. Go ahead, please invite our Prime Minister of India, because it won't make any sense. And my own feeling is it's still not very clear. Maybe I could be proven wrong, but a recalibration is going on. This thinking that, yeah, we were maybe Pakistan was being rehabilitated or being propped up again, but it's pointless. Because at the end of the day, the China Pakistan link is there. It's there for see. China will remain hostile to you guys. And at the end of the day, India still is a friendly country to the US and to US interests. Never mind, US plays hopscotch with us. That's the best I can describe it. We sometimes wonder why is US behaving like this with us, this, that, and etc. But still, we are democracies. There is so much in common, and therefore, my personal feeling is a recalibration probably would be going on right now. That yes, India is essential to our scheme of things, and don't ever forget the Quad thing also, which is very very important. Because please remember the Quad thing at any given point in time, if push comes to shove, can be converted from a non-military alliance to a military alliance if there is a need, an existential need for that arises. That's why Quad is there. That's the reason you have to remember. And therefore, this realization, this massive um earthquake, I would say, a geopolitical earthquake, two earthquakes rather, I would say. The first I talked to you about when India suddenly emerged supreme in terms of military prowess, which shook the world, which threatened the world, I would say, which made the world insecure, and that's why Pakistan was propped up. And now suddenly everybody realizes that it's still the old problem. The old problem hasn't gone away. The old problem still happens to be China, both to the US and to Europe for that matter. Because what if China can do that to US, it can certainly do that to Europe very, very easily. And the Europeans know that. And that is why I am arguing again and again that in the long term, the US and Europe have no choice but to gravitate towards India rather than China. They have no choice, really, if you think about it. Because India is not a hegemonistic country. India is not a country which will, which will kind of uh, dig you from the roots, and you will turn things upside down for you. We are, at the end of the day, we are a decent country. We are a country which says what it does really. The most, in that sense, our workers which go out, our immigrants who go to other countries are good, honest peoples by and large. Never mind the Khalistanis, they're a different species, of course, altogether. And therefore, the gravitation of the US and Europe towards India uh, and not China is not an option at all. It is it is an existential issue for both the European bloc and for the US. They have to do it, and India knows this, and that's why look at the sagacity of our leadership that we kept quiet despite all these provocations during Operation Sindur. We kept our peace. We did not say anything. But now, as I say, the chickens are coming home to roost. It'll be interesting to see how these confabulation between these tops G7 and of course leaders of India, Brazil, and other countries happen at Canada. But I am pretty sure this narrative is going to come out that the world, the top powers of the world, India is sits on the high table. They need India. They can't do without India. The India story is still intact. And so, on this note, I come to the end of this podcast. I hope you really liked it. You like the show? Do subscribe to it. And on this note, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.